On September 2nd, 1945, the teak deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay was packed with Allied commanders. After years of brutal combat, they were expecting a triumphant, retributive spectacle to end the bloodiest war in human history. General Douglas MacArthur stepped to the microphone. But instead of a fiery speech of conquest, his tone was remarkably subdued, even philosophical. The public degradation of the Japanese Empire, demanded by politicians and frontline troops alike, simply did not happen. If the Allies had their shattered enemy completely at their mercy, why did the Supreme Commander refuse to deliver the vengeance everyone expected? This absence of vengeance was not a sudden bout of mercy, nor a gesture of forgiveness. It was a highly calculated political maneuver designed to secure absolute control over a shattered empire. How did Douglas MacArthur transform the ultimate military triumph into a deliberate act of restraint? And why was avoiding the public humiliation of Japan's leadership the crucial first step to safely occupying a hostile, devastated nation of 70 million people? We're going to dismantle the enduring myths of the surrender deck to reveal the cold, pragmatic mechanics of the transition from total war to total occupation. The Allied command was caught in a dangerous tension, balancing the overwhelming emotional demand for a crushing, retributive victory against the strict mechanical requirements of a successful political takeover. Humiliating the Japanese delegates might have satisfied the frontline troops and the public back home, but it risked triggering a massive, uncontrollable insurgency across the home islands. To understand how this calculated restraint became the foundational weapon of the American occupation, we must first look at the impossible logistical and political puzzle MacArthur faced just days before the ceremony. In late August 1945, the prevailing mood across the Allied nations was not merely one of exhaustion or relief, but of a profound, collective demand for retribution. The Pacific theater had been defined by a terrifying escalation of savagery, from the claustrophobic, disease-ridden jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima and the brutal, grinding attrition of Okinawa. The combat had been merciless. Surrender on the battlefield had been an extreme rarity. Reports of systematic atrocities, the harrowing conditions of prisoner of war camps, and the fanatical, suicidal resistance of the Imperial Japanese Army had thoroughly hardened American public opinion. Politicians in Washington, the global press, and the exhausted infantrymen waiting on staging islands in the Marianas and the Philippines fully expected a reckoning. They envisioned the incoming subjugation of Japan as a punitive expedition. The enemy was to be brought to their knees, stripped of every symbol of authority, and made to feel the absolute, crushing weight of their defeat. But General Douglas MacArthur, newly appointed as the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, was staring at a very different reality. The emotional desire for vengeance, while completely understandable for troops who had bled across the Pacific, was entirely disconnected from the sheer logistical nightmare of the impending occupation. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the sudden, massive Soviet invasion of Manchuria, had indeed forced the Japanese government to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. However, this capitulation was a fragile political decision made at the highest executive levels, forced through by the emperor himself. It was not a total military collapse on the ground. Across the Japanese home islands, the mathematics of the situation were chilling. There were still over 4 million heavily armed, highly trained soldiers stationed within the country. In addition to the regular army, millions of civilian militia members had been aggressively mobilized and trained with whatever weapons were available for Operation Ketsugo, the planned last-ditch defense of the homeland. This was a population conditioned for decades by an authoritarian state to view the emperor as a living deity and to equate national surrender with spiritual and physical annihilation. Against this intact, deeply indoctrinated force, MacArthur was preparing to send an initial occupation vanguard of just a few tens of thousands of troops. While the United States possessed overwhelming naval and air supremacy off the coast, boots on the ground were critically scarce in those first critical days. The Eighth Army and the Far East Air Forces were still organizing the massive logistical train required to move fully equipped divisions across the vast expanse of the Pacific. The early airborne and amphibious landings would be incredibly vulnerable. If the Japanese population or the local military commanders perceived the occupation as a campaign of humiliation and destruction, the precarious consensus to surrender could shatter overnight. MacArthur and his planning staff understood that if the Allied forces acted like conquerors seeking immediate vengeance, they would instantly ignite a nationwide insurgency. A decentralized guerrilla war fought in the rugged, mountainous terrain of Honshu and Kyushu would bleed the American military for years to come. The sheer logistical reality dictated that the United States simply did not have the manpower, the local knowledge, or the resources to govern Japan by direct, coercive force at the municipal level. They desperately needed the existing Japanese state apparatus, the local police, the civil bureaucracy, and most importantly, the unchallenged authority of the emperor to enforce the surrender upon their own people. This realization transformed MacArthur's entire strategic approach to the surrender. He recognized that public degradation of the Japanese leadership would not demonstrate Allied strength. Instead, it would project a fatal lack of discipline that could unravel the entire operation. To safely insert a relatively small American force into a heavily armed hostile nation, the occupation had to be managed through profound psychological dominance, not just physical presence. The Japanese government had to be kept functioning, and its leaders had to retain enough dignity in the eyes of their subordinates to issue orders that would actually be obeyed and respected. Restraint, therefore, became a calculated, weaponized instrument of mass control. By treating the surrendering officials with rigid, formal correctness rather than contempt, MacArthur intended to send a clear psychological message. The Allies were in absolute command, possessing a power so complete and assured that it did not require petty vindictiveness or theatrical cruelty. It was a strategy designed to shock the Japanese command structure, not with violence, but with an unexpected, almost bewildering bureaucratic order. The Supreme Commander was preparing to use the deeply ingrained Japanese respect for hierarchy and authority against them, deliberately co-opting the imperial structure to dismantle the empire from within. It was an audacious political gamble. MacArthur was deliberately defying the bloodlust of his own frontline troops and the expectations of the American public to execute a deeply pragmatic, cold-blooded, psychological operation. The meticulous plan relied entirely on projecting an aura of unshakable, calm authority. But this theory of weaponized restraint, drafted in secure headquarters and logistical centers, was about to be severely tested in the real world. The delicate balance could easily be destroyed by a single misstep, a rogue action by a bitter Allied officer, or a provocation the moment the Japanese leadership physically stepped onto the deck of the American warship. The ultimate test of this psychological architecture began at 8:56 a.m. on September 2nd. A small American destroyer, the USS Lansdowne, transferred the 11-man Japanese delegation to the Missouri. Climbing the ship's accommodation ladder was a grueling physical effort for the civilian leader of the delegation, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu. Having lost his right leg to an assassin's bomb in 1932, Shigemitsu leaned heavily on a cane, his wooden prosthetic limb clanking awkwardly against the metal steps. Behind him stood General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, his face locked in a mask of grim, rigid stoicism. Umezu had vehemently opposed the surrender, only yielding to the direct, unprecedented command of the emperor. For decades, a persistent post-war legend has surrounded Umezu's behavior in these opening minutes. The popular narrative claims that the furious general brazenly refused to salute or bow to the Allied commanders, striking a pose of theatrical, arrogant defiance on the deck. It is a compelling story of unbowed martial pride, but the primary sources tell a completely different story. Archival footage and eyewitness accounts confirm there was no dramatic act of rebellion. Umezu did not refuse to salute. Rather, the meticulously negotiated protocol strictly dictated that neither side would exchange military salutes. There were no handshakes, no formal pleasantries, and absolutely no opportunities for individual grandstanding. Umezu simply stood exactly where he was ordered to stand, trapped in the agonizing constraints of defeat. The reality of that morning was not theatrical defiance, but a suffocating, almost unbearable diplomatic silence. Hundreds of Allied officers, sailors, and combat veterans crowded every available inch of the superstructure, their eyes fixed on the 11 Japanese officials. The psychological pressure was immense. Any slight gesture, a lingering stare, or a sudden movement could have been interpreted as a provocation, risking a catastrophic breakdown in discipline among the assembled victors. MacArthur, watching closely before stepping to the microphone, aggressively enforced this sterile environment. He was not looking for microaggressions to punish. He was actively ignoring any perceived slights to maintain absolute forward momentum. He demanded a swift, profoundly impersonal, businesslike procedure. By stripping the ceremony of all emotion, he denied his own men the satisfaction of mockery, and he denied the Japanese delegates the dignity of martyrdom. The delegates had been successfully brought aboard without incident. The tense, silent standoff held, but the physical apparatus of the transition still lay ahead. With the fragile protocol initiated and the hostile silence successfully managed, MacArthur stepped forward. He now had to flawlessly execute the most meticulously micromanaged 23 minutes in diplomatic history. The veranda deck of the USS Missouri had been transformed into a theater of absolute, almost suffocating control. Every square inch of the teak planks, every angle of approach, and every ticking second on the ship's chronometers had been mapped out with the relentless precision of a naval bombardment. The physical space itself was explicitly designed to immediately isolate and dwarf the 11 Japanese delegates. They were positioned facing a simple mess table covered in a green baize cloth. Behind that table stood General Douglas MacArthur, and behind him, an impenetrable, tightly packed wall of Allied commanders, representing the combined military might of the entire coalition. There were no chairs provided for the Japanese delegation. There were no provisions for negotiation, no private rooms for consultation, and no concessions to diplomatic comfort. They were placed exactly where MacArthur's choreography demanded, standing beneath the immense looming shadows of the Missouri's towering 16-inch forward gun turrets, entirely exposed to the glaring morning sun and the unblinking hostile gaze of hundreds of Allied servicemen who crowded every available deck, ladder, and superstructure. MacArthur understood that in a moment of supreme historical vulnerability, chaos is the absolute enemy of authority. He orchestrated the timeline down to the minute. The ceremony was strictly ordered to begin at exactly 0900 hours, not a moment earlier or later, projecting an image of an Allied command that moved with unstoppable, mechanical inevitability. Above them, framed against the gray steel of the ship's bulkheads, flew a very specific, fragile American flag. It was the historic banner flown by Commodore Matthew Perry when his black ships sailed into Tokyo Bay in 1853, using the threat of naval artillery to force a reclusive Japan open to the world. Displaying it now was a calculated, silent historical echo. It declared without a single spoken word that the brief, bloody, and catastrophic era of the Japanese Empire's expansion was permanently closed, and foreign dominance had forcefully returned to their shores. But the true architecture of control that morning lay not in the historic flags or the towering steel bulkheads, but in the paperwork resting on the green baize table, Two oversized documents lay waiting. One was bound in heavy, gold-tooled leather. This was the official Allied copy of the Instrument of Surrender. The other was bound in rough, plain canvas. This was the Japanese copy. The distinction was subtle but highly deliberate, physically reinforcing the hierarchy of the New World Order. However, the most critical and dangerous element of the entire morning was the meticulously planned sequence of the signatures. MacArthur explicitly demanded that the Japanese delegation must sign the documents first. This was not merely a matter of traditional diplomatic protocol, nor was it a final, petty humiliation to make the vanquished kneel before the victors. It was a cold, precise, and highly necessary legal snare. The Supreme Commander knew better than anyone that the Allied coalition, comprising the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and several other nations, was a fragile alliance of convenience that was already beginning to fracture under the immense geopolitical pressure of the impending Cold War. If an Allied commander, particularly the Soviet representative, signed the document first, and then the Japanese delegates balked, delayed, or found some obscure legal technicality to refuse their signatures, the Allies would be left holding a meaningless piece of paper. Their internal political divisions would be suddenly and dangerously exposed to the enemy, right on the deck of the flagship. By forcing Japan to sign first, MacArthur intended to legally and permanently bind the Japanese state and its military apparatus before the Allies even lifted a fountain pen. At 9:04, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu was ordered forward. Leaning heavily on his wooden cane, he struggled painfully into the single chair provided at the table. He fumbled nervously with his pocket watch, his cane, and his yellow gloves. For several agonizing seconds, looking down at the dense foreign text, he seemed unable to locate the correct line to sign. MacArthur, watching with glacial, unyielding impatience, sharply ordered his chief of staff, General Richard Sutherland, to step forward and point directly to the exact spot on the parchment. Shigemitsu finally signed his name, officially surrendering the civilian Japanese government and, by constitutional extension, acknowledging the total submission of the emperor. A moment later, General Yoshijiro Umezu stepped to the table. Disdaining the chair, Umezu remained standing, his posture rigid, and quickly slashed his name across the documents. This second signature was vital. Historically, the Imperial Japanese military had operated independently of the civilian government, often defying it entirely. Umezu's signature meant the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were now officially and legally surrendered by their highest uniformed commander. Both the state and the sword were pinned down simultaneously. In less than 5 minutes, the Empire of Japan had legally ceased to exist as an independent military power. Only now, with the enemy irrevocably bound by their own hands, would MacArthur and the Allied representatives approach the table to accept the capitulation. To truly understand the profound effectiveness of this sterile, bureaucratic procedure, one must look closely at the psychological state of the men standing on the other side of the green table. Behind their impassive expressions, formal top hats, and rigid military uniforms, the Japanese delegation was consumed by a profound, suffocating terror. For weeks leading up to this morning, Tokyo had been paralyzed by dark rumors of exactly what the Americans would do once they had the high command trapped in their grasp. The Japanese leadership had ruthlessly operated an empire that routinely utilized public humiliation, torture, summary executions, and starvation to subjugate conquered populations across Asia. Measuring the enemy by their own standards, they naturally assumed the Americans would apply the exact same brutal mathematics of victory. Toshikazu Kase, a high-ranking diplomat and close aide to Shigemitsu, who stood on the Missouri's deck that morning, later recorded the delegation's intense internal dread in his diaries. They fully expected the ceremony to be a barbaric, retributive spectacle. They anticipated being dragged before a screaming, vindictive mob of heavily armed Allied combat veterans. They deeply feared immediate arrest as war criminals the exact moment they set foot on the battleship, and some even braced for summary execution against the ship's bulkheads. As they made the long, agonizing transit across Tokyo Bay aboard the American destroyer Lansdowne, passing the towering gray steel cliffs of the surrounding American armada, Kase noted that they felt exactly like condemned prisoners being led directly to the executioner's block. The sheer physical presence of the enemy fleet was overwhelming. The contrast between the burned-out, ash-covered ruins of Tokyo they had just left behind and the pristine, terrifying industrial might of the American warships broke their morale before they even reached the flagship. Every American sailor staring down at them from the decks, the gun tubs, and the rigging felt like a silent, lethal accusation. They stepped onto the veranda deck, fully expecting to be hit with a wall of verbal abuse, to be physically assaulted, or to be forced to their knees in front of the world's cameras. The anticipation of sudden violence was so thick, it was almost physical. But the abuse they had braced for never came. Instead of a fiery, posturing warlord demanding blood, they were met by Douglas MacArthur, acting as an impassive, methodical, and chillingly calm administrator. MacArthur's physical presentation itself was a calculated shock. He did not dress like a traditional conqueror, draped in gold braid, ceremonial swords, or glittering rows of medals. He wore a simple, open-collared khaki service shirt, stripped of all theatrical military pomp. He looked less like an avenging emperor and more like a stern corporate manager arriving to liquidate a bankrupt company. Before the signing began, MacArthur stepped to the microphone and delivered a short, carefully drafted address. The Japanese delegates stiffened, bracing for a furious tirade, recounting the atrocities of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and Manila. Instead, MacArthur's voice rolled out across the silent deck, steady, resonant, and remarkably devoid of vengeance. He stated clearly that it was not his purpose to meet in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred, but rather to emerge from the blood and carnage of the past into a world dedicated to the dignity of man. He spoke of administrative mandates, of future peace, of the strict compliance expected of the Japanese state, and of the heavy responsibilities of the victors. For the terrified Japanese delegation, the psychological effect of this speech was akin to a shockwave. MacArthur's complete and utter lack of emotional vindictiveness did not signal weakness or forgiveness. It signaled an absolute, unshakable confidence. By refusing to gloat, MacArthur was telling them that the United States military was so vastly superior, its victory so thoroughly unquestionable, that it simply did not need to raise its voice. Toshikazu Kase later admitted that this cold, procedural demeanor instantly disarmed the delegation's panic. The paralyzing terror of a bloody, chaotic retribution evaporated on the deck, replaced by the sudden, stark realization that they were dealing with a highly organized, ruthlessly efficient, and thoroughly bureaucratic occupation machine. Ironically, by treating the architects of the Pacific War with formal, frigid respect, MacArthur secured their total psychological submission. The delegates realized in that exact moment that their survival and the survival of their devastated nation depended entirely on integrating perfectly into this new, methodical American apparatus. The vast, disciplined silence of the Allied commanders was far more terrifying and far more effective than any shouted insults or physical blows could ever have been. MacArthur could afford this profound diplomatic restraint entirely because of the staggering physical reality surrounding the ceremony. He did not need to hurl threats across the green baize table because the United States Navy was silently doing all the threatening for him. The USS Missouri, displacing 45,000 tons of armored steel, was a floating fortress capable of leveling entire city blocks from miles offshore. Above the signing table, The ship's massive 16-inch gun barrels were elevated toward the sky, silent but impossible for the delegates to ignore. And the Missouri was just one single vessel. Anchored in the dark waters of Tokyo Bay were 258 Allied warships. It was the greatest concentration of naval power in human history. A staggering armada stretching out to the horizon in every direction. Battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers formed an impenetrable ring of steel around the Japanese home islands. While just offshore, the massive decks of the American aircraft carriers were loaded with strike aircraft, ready to launch at a moment's notice. This was the ultimate trump card in MacArthur's psychological operation. The bureaucratic restraint shown on the veranda deck was only possible because it was backed by the constant, implicit threat of total, apocalyptic annihilation. The Japanese delegates did not need to be reminded that any resistance to the incoming occupation forces would be mercilessly crushed. They only had to look over the ship's railing to see the instruments of their destruction. The stark contrast between the quiet, orderly scratching of fountain pens on parchment and the surrounding armada of destructive machinery created an overwhelming sense of finality. The Allied command was clearly demonstrating that they possessed the capability to physically erase Japan from the map at any moment, but they were choosing, through sheer administrative will, to manage it instead. It was a display of power so absolute, so complete, that it rendered explicit violence entirely unnecessary. With the Japanese signatures secured, the procedure moved forward flawlessly. Following MacArthur's own signature as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, the senior representatives of the victorious nations stepped up to the table one by one in a strictly predetermined sequence. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signed for the United States. General Su Young Chang signed for the Republic of China. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser signed for the United Kingdom. Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevianko stepped forward for the Soviet Union, followed by General Sir Thomas Blamey for Australia. The mechanical, deliberate rhythm of the ceremony seemed unstoppable. Each commander approached the table, signed the heavy leather Allied copy, then signed the canvas-bound Japanese copy, and stepped back into the ranks. MacArthur's masterful orchestration of both the psychological pressure and the physical space appeared to have resulted in a perfect, unblemished legal victory. The Japanese state had surrendered. The fragile Allied coalition had presented a unified front. The highly dangerous transition from total war to total occupation was unfolding exactly according to the meticulous script drafted in Manila. The immense, suffocating tension on the deck finally began to ease slightly as the final national delegates approached the table to secure their place in history. It seemed that the impossible diplomatic and logistical puzzle had been solved without a single operational flaw. But the facade of absolute, impenetrable control was ultimately an illusion. The machinery of this perfectly engineered legal ceremony was about to be thrown into sudden, unforeseen chaos. As the representative for the Dominion of Canada, Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave stepped out of the ranks, approached the green table, and unspooled his pen. He looked down at the lines of text on the two oversized documents. In the blinding glare of the Tokyo Bay sun, amidst the immense historical pressure of the moment, Cosgrave made a single, catastrophic error. With one misplaced stroke of ink on the wrong line of the canvas document, he inadvertently threatened to invalidate the entire Japanese copy of the surrender, risking a massive diplomatic crisis before the ink was even dry. Colonel Moore Cosgrave, a World War I veteran blinded in one eye, signed his name just below his designated line on the canvas-bound Japanese copy. By placing his signature on the space strictly reserved for the French Republic, he triggered a cascading formatting disaster. The French representative was forced to sign on the line meant for the Netherlands. The Dutch admiral then signed where New Zealand belonged. By the time the final Allied delegate finished, the Japanese copy of the instrument of surrender was a misaligned, chaotic mess. When the document was handed to the Japanese delegation, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu immediately spotted the error and froze. He knew he could not take this flawed parchment back to Tokyo. In the hyper-formal political culture of the Japanese government, a legal instrument with misplaced signatures was not just a clerical oversight, it was a potentially fatal loophole. If Shigemitsu presented an improperly formatted treaty, remaining military hardliners could seize upon the technicality. They might argue the Allies had breached protocol, using the error as a pretext to declare the surrender invalid and ignite a suicidal insurgency. The Japanese delegation flatly refused to accept the document. The meticulously orchestrated, unstoppable momentum of MacArthur's ceremony suddenly ground to a halt. The sterile psychological dominance the Supreme Commander had so carefully built was rapidly unraveling over a mundane bureaucratic mistake. Seeing his flawless operation stalling, MacArthur ordered his Chief of Staff, General Richard Sutherland, to resolve the crisis immediately. Sutherland approached the Japanese delegation, took back the canvas document, and drew his own fountain pen. He applied a brutal, pragmatic solution. With quick strokes, he simply crossed out the printed titles of the Allied nations with heavy ink, manually wrote the correct titles next to the misplaced signatures, and hastily initialed the messy corrections himself. The pristine historical artifact was now a scarred, improvised compromise, but legally, the trap remained closed. Sutherland handed the corrected paperwork back to the unsettled Japanese delegation. The bureaucratic crisis was averted, and the enemy was finally bound by paper. But a scratched-up document was not MacArthur's final word. With the paperwork barely saved by an improvised scratch of a pen, how did the Supreme Commander deliver his ultimate, undeniable message to the defeated empire? General Douglas MacArthur stepped back to the microphone. With the hastily corrected canvas document now firmly in the hands of the Japanese delegation, the Supreme Commander looked across the green baize table and spoke his final official words. These proceedings are closed. It was exactly 23 minutes past 9. The most destructive conflict in human history had been formally terminated with the sterile brevity of a board meeting. There was no victory parade on the teak deck. There were no brass bands blaring triumphant marches, no cheering formations parading the vanquished leadership in chains. MacArthur had ruthlessly stripped the moment of any physical degradation, but he had not foregone a display of dominance. He had simply relocated it. As MacArthur turned away from the microphone, a low, heavy rumble began to vibrate through the armor-plated hull of the USS Missouri. Within seconds, the overcast sky above Tokyo Bay began to tear open. Sweeping in from the south, flying at barely 1,500 feet, came an aerial armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. A massive, synchronized formation of over 400 B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers, accompanied by more than 1,000 carrier-based fighters, roared directly over the Allied fleet. The sheer sensory overload was staggering. The combined thrust of thousands of radial engines created a deafening, chest-rattling thunder that drowned out every voice on the battleship. It cast a massive, rolling shadow over the water, physically dwarfing the surrounding fleet and the ruined city of Tokyo smoking in the distance. This was MacArthur's true, undeniable message. He did not need to hurl insults at the 11 Japanese delegates standing silently on the deck, because the sky itself was currently screaming. The flyover was a flawless display of absolute mechanical, logistical, and technological supremacy. It required no translation, no diplomatic interpreters, and no legal signatures. It violently demonstrated the staggering industrial apparatus the United States had constructed to win the Pacific War. For the Japanese delegation, clutching their flawed parchment beneath the roaring engines, the reality of their defeat was no longer a legal abstraction. It was a suffocating physical weight pressing down from above. The overwhelming mechanical spectacle completely replaced the need for theatrical vengeance. cementing MacArthur's psychological dominance without sacrificing an ounce of Allied discipline. At 9:30, the Japanese delegates were escorted back down the accommodation ladder, the ceremony concluding exactly on schedule. But as the deafening roar of the aircraft finally faded over the gray waters of Tokyo Bay, a terrifying uncertainty remained. What did this highly controlled, 23-minute spectacle actually mean for the immediate future of a shattered Japan and the rapidly fracturing post-war world? The 23 minutes orchestrated on the teak deck of the Missouri provided the exact blueprint for the American occupation of Japan. MacArthur's calculated refusal to humiliate the vanquished leadership was not a gesture of post-war healing, but the foundational mechanism of his political control. By consciously denying the Allied troops their expected spectacle of vengeance, the Supreme Commander preserved the fragile authority of the Japanese state. To safely dismantle a highly militarized, indoctrinated empire of 70 million people, he had to use their own command structure against them. Keeping the emperor shielded from public degradation and utilizing him as a compliant administrative figurehead accomplished what military force alone could never guarantee. It neutralized the fanatical threat of the civilian militias and entirely bypassed the nightmare of a protracted guerrilla insurgency across the home islands. The Japanese bureaucracy, terrified by the sheer mechanical might of the Allied armada, but disarmed by the cold professionalism of the surrender proceedings, complied with the occupation directives flawlessly. Rapid demilitarization, the dismantling of the imperial war machine, and sweeping constitutional reforms were driven through not at the barrel of a gun, but through the precise, weaponized, bureaucratic restraint established that morning. The ceremony in Tokyo Bay was never truly about closing the final chapter of the Second World War. It was the first highly successful psychological operation of the incoming post-war era, a masterclass in utilizing the threat of absolute violence to enforce total political submission. By mastering the tension between military retribution and political necessity, MacArthur proved that avoiding vengeance was the ultimate tool for achieving absolute subjugation. This delicate balance between overwhelming force and clinical administration leads directly to the core philosophy deployed on that deck, offering a profound lesson in the true nature of conquest. Douglas MacArthur understood a fundamental truth about total war that had eluded both vengeful politicians back in Washington and the exhausted combat veterans waiting across the Pacific. The ultimate demonstration of absolute power was never going to be found in physically crushing a humiliated, broken enemy beneath the boot of an avenging conqueror. Instead, true, unassailable dominance lay in stripping away the theatrics of revenge, silencing the massive guns of the fleet, and calmly dictating the exact mechanical terms of a defeated empire's survival.